So welcome, friends, to this first Ventures course of the season. Uh, if you are looking for the course Supporting Children Overwhelmed by Anxiety, you found the right place to be. If that's not the course you're looking for, you're joining us anyway. And so we're glad that this current semester of courses is going to be really full of a lot of neat things, including looking at the Psalms, looking at grief, and then we have more things coming up in the spring. But for right now, I'm just really glad to have John and Adam Wenger with us. And I'd like to take a moment to introduce them to you, although John and Adam, I will trust you'll say a little bit more because I'll keep my remarks brief. But just to sort of set the context, John is a psychologist and a graduate of Manchester College. He received his Ph.D. from Purdue University and worked as a counselor for 49 years, mostly in private practice. He's now retired and he consults with the county mental health court. John is a member of the Anderson, Indiana Church of the Brethren and has served the church as District Moderator and on the Association of Brethren Caregivers Board and on the Mission and Ministry Board. And currently he's a board member at Timbercrest Senior Living Community. Adam, his son, graduated from Manchester College as well and received his master's in psychology at Ball State University. He's a quality assurance specialist at the Indianapolis Head Start Agency currently. And so with that, we're looking forward to the two of you taking us through understanding anxiety in children and helping give us some insight in how we can be helpful in all of that. So I'm just going to turn it over to the two of you and let you take it away.
Thank you. We have a PowerPoint to help us in our discussion this morning, and hopefully we don't have too many glitches on how to get through that. Thank goodness Adam and Enton speak the same language when it comes to computers, because computers and I are not friendly. We want you to feel free to ask questions as we go through this morning and to make comments. We know each of you bring your own expertise and experience that will be very helpful on this topic. Because we have a large group, we may need to redirect some questions and discussion toward the end, but we hope you feel free not to hesitate to interrupt at any time when we're speaking, because your questions and your thoughts will be very, very helpful. We will initiate conversation around the PowerPoint, but then we may take the PowerPoint off the screen so it's easier to communicate together. If any of you fall asleep because it's too boring or you stayed up late, we may try to wake you up, but otherwise we have our coffee, and we hope that you join us in whatever can help you feel stimulated as we go through this morning. We'll go with the next slide, Adam. Here's kind of the agenda for this morning. We're going to start with some questions that will maybe help us get to know each other a little better. And then we'll move on to talking about anxiety and stress and the common factors that contribute to anxiety. We'll try to take a break about every hour. So we'll see how that goes. And then we're going to have another poll and then talk more about interventions at the end of that.
And if you would be so kind as to put the icebreakers up, we'll go ahead and start with that then.
Sounds good. Do you want to leave the sharing on or just or go back to the group for the icebreaker?
I'll go ahead and go back.
Yeah, and I'll put up the first icebreaker then. And so, friends, there's the question. You've got two main answers, and for those that may not be in the US, a third. So feel free just to go ahead and share your answers. And about half of you have responded so far, so keep on clicking. By the way, Adam and John, a question from Cindy. She was wondering if you'd be willing to make PowerPoints of your slides available later, or if they need to take more copious notes.
Nope, we can make it available.
Good. So I'll plan to send those out. And I would suggest that you take notes on things you think are important, but remember, you're also going to have access to a recording, so you'll always be able to go back. So here's the results of the first poll. It's a 50-50 split.
Wow, that's neat.
Nice to know we're getting a wide diversity of people from different areas and different life experiences here.
Okay, you ready for the second?
I believe we are.
Coming up. Have you been to annual conference at least 5 times?
Looks like 70-30 split there. So that's a pretty good number of people that have about 70% say they've been to 5 or more, and 30% have not had the opportunity yet.
And actually, I'm really delighted that no one chose that last one. What is annual conference? Okay, you ready for number 3?
Yep.
Here you are. Were you raised in the Church of the Brethren? Yes, no, or I'm not Church of the Brethren. Oh, goodness. So I'll share the results here. John and Adam, any comments on that?
Well, it's interesting. 2/3 grew up in the church, but it's nice to see that an additional third of the people here have decided to join us and commune with us in this denomination.
Okay, back to you all.
Okay. Well, let us bring up the PowerPoint again. Okay, here we are.
Well, we wanted to start off with something pretty basic. I think we all know this, but the definition of anxiety, according to the Oxford Learning Dictionary, anxiety is defined as the state of feeling nervous or worried that something bad is going to happen. I've done a number of speaking weekends in churches throughout the years. And when I spoke to Beacon Heights up in Fort Wayne, there was a wonderful member of their church that was a photographer for the local newspaper. And he made a number of brochures and placards to hang around. And he defined stress this way: stress, the spice of life that sometimes causes indigestion. Now, I've always liked that. There's a lot of professional definitions of stress, but that's the one I always refer back to. From going to further education to marriage to all kinds of things in life, new experiences are stressful. And for some, it's the indigestion is too much to continue. And for others, they learn to live with that as a normal part of life, and they continue then to let that spice of life direct them throughout life. So we'll be talking about those who get stuck with the indigestion and have difficulty moving on, versus how stress is a very, very positive part of our life. Another similar thing, I did taught a doctor of ministry class with Gene Roop at Anderson University several years ago, and the title of our class was on conflict, and it dealt with how conflict is a very important part of our living together. Stress can go ahead.
Stress, as everyone knows, has a negative connotation to it, but it doesn't have to be negative. It can also be positive. Some positive aspects of stress will include learning to cope with adversity and applying incentives to progress and advance. I don't know how many people out there are procrastinators like myself, but if you are, you definitely understand stress. Last minute, you got to get something done. That stress really motivates you to push forward and get done what you need to. So that is a positive use of stress. The problem is when you have too much stress to handle, it becomes overwhelming. So that would include elevated psychological and physical distress, and making the person feel overwhelmed. So an example of this could be like test anxiety. The stress gets to the point so much that it causes a freeze in the behavior, and you're unable to get past
it. We won't ask you to do a poll on how many of you think you may score on the obsessive compulsive scale, but my guess is that some of you join Adam and I with that diagnosis. And part of obsessive compulsive behavior often tends to be procrastination and perfectionistic expectations as well. I remember back in my Manchester days when I tended to tell myself at the beginning of each semester that I was going to get my term papers done early, and I tended to wait till the last moment. Not because I wasn't constantly thinking about it, but because of the anxiety of wondering whether if I finished it, it would really be good enough. And so we deal with that kind of anxiety in our life. It's easy to expect ourselves as perfectionists sometimes. It's easy to expect ourselves to do about 130% of what is realistic. And that has shut down a number of us from being able to move forward. Well, we're going to talk about a lot of different causes for anxiety as we go through today, but some of those are imposed by the environment in which we live, and some of those are simply imposed by ourselves and our own expectations of what we should expect. How often is perfectionism connected to OCD? That's a good question. Perfectionism is not always with OCD, although probably OCD behavior, there's a lot of perfectionists who are OCD. OCD also includes a number of other kinds of compulsive behaviors as well. So some potential consequences of intense, prolonged anxiety. So these would be certain things like what we would call subclinical. So that would be social difficulties, decreased efficiency and ability, avoidance of new opportunities, experience, decreased confidence. I'm sure everyone at some point has felt some of these where you're just so anxious that you are having trouble focusing or something like that. Some of the clinical consequences of the prolonged and intense anxiety would include OCD, which is obsessive compulsive behavior, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, physical health concerns, including vascular issues, sleep disturbances, headaches. So all of these can be consequences of intense and prolonged anxiety. I noticed a statement on there. Let me get that.
Let's put it up over here.
Yeah.
Let's go down to the bottom.
Yeah. a friend of ours with OCD says that if someone with OCD has termed a diagnosis, it would have been CDO. Yeah.
Yep, that makes sense.
Yeah. The what we're going to look at with anxiety and with the subcategories is the degree of extreme, to what end, and how extreme is that behavior. OCD behavior, being on the spectrum, may be extremely helpful in accomplishing things, but it's kind of like an athlete. I've seen, if you've ever participated in sports or in public speaking, if you don't have a few butterflies in your stomach, it may not go very well. You kind of need some of that juices flowing to produce maximum effect. But boy, when we get to a certain place, we can drop off the cliff. And all of a sudden, what was productive and helped improve our ability, all of a sudden totally destroyed any ability to accomplish whatever the goal was. And so we're not opposed to anxiety. Anxiety can be very motivating. What we're going to be looking at is what happens when anxiety gets so overwhelming that it shuts the door toward normal development.
Absolutely. So I think everyone is well aware that there are similarities in how adults and children will experience the world, and there are differences in how adults and children will experience the world. As you're aware, stress is a universal experience that is encountered in all developmental stages of life. So an example that was given on how severe anxiety or a trauma can be, depending on the age range, is for a 4-year-old, if they lose their teddy bear, it can be as traumatic as an adult losing their business, because that is what they see their whole world wrapped up in. So it's kind of beneficial when you're working with children to understand that what is a big trauma to them may not seem as traumatic to you. We are trying to work with them from where they're at, not where we think they should be.
Once a trauma is not resolved or addressed, that trauma can greatly affect, as we all know, the direction and the options of one's life moving forward. And so we want to look at how it affects the children with whom we live. And since I think all of us on this educational experience have been children, we may think back to our childhood, and was there a trauma or a specific time in our life that at least temporarily stopped us from other kinds of life milestones? And we're going to talk about how that happened for many throughout certain times in history. But if we look at our own personal lives, at what point, think a moment, at what point did a particular trauma or event kind of shut down other milestones from being experienced? At what point did we develop a dislike or even a fear for certain kinds of other experiences that we might have in our life? We can look at that. There may be certain foods you don't like, and it may relate to the taste, but it may well relate to a negative experience about that food. And all of a sudden, from there on, we kind of avoid that food or that experience. Not that it stops us from living a good quality life, but it does get in the way of some of the kinds of life experiences that we could continue to have. And that's unfortunate. So that trauma may affect safe choices. It may affect trust issues. It may have been something in our life that all of a sudden there's certain people or certain experiences we don't trust. It may affect our perception of who is safe and who is not in our life. That, as we said, may limit future options from foods, from experiences, the experiences we allow ourselves to have. It may affect where we feel safe and where we don't. We probably all have seen, like we said, good athletes who give up on a sport because of their frustration. And all of a sudden, it's not meeting the expectation they have. I love to play golf, but I do not ever expect to be very good at it. It is a great way to, at 77, to have 7 miles of walk-in. And as long as I don't pay too close of attention to my score. But I've played with some younger folks who expect that if they keep playing golf, they should drop a stroke about every week. And I've seen some of those young folks give up on the game by the time they're 16 because they're frustrated, because the anxiety, their self-worth can't keep up with the expectations that they have. If there's any comments, please chime in. We welcome that.
More than happy to be interrupted if you have any questions or comments. So differences in how stress can be exhibited between children and adults, the ability to utilize language to express the experience. So language development, as we're all aware, hopefully we've all been around very young children. And as they are starting to talk and communicate, you can see the frustration build up in them as they're not being understood in what they're trying to express. So this can contribute to a child's additional stress levels, because younger children may not have the linguistic ability to put into words what's going on. Likewise, this can be something that is experienced by people who say their native language isn't English and they are in this community. They may have a frustration in putting into words exactly what it is that they are trying to express. Additionally, there's an awareness of potential stressors. An adult I'm going to shrink this for a second so I can read. An adult may be feeling a sense of distress due to work pressure, whereas a child may experience the same feelings with no awareness of the cause. So they could easily have the same sensations of that stress experience, but not comprehend exactly why they're feeling it, which can lead to additional stressors on those children.
Yeah. When I first started off 50 years ago, because I was a 6th grade school teacher and then an elementary school counselor before I finished my doctorate, I was primarily seeing children in my practice, which was wonderful. There's not many jobs where you can be paid to sit on the floor and play with children. And so it was a wonderful position. But even though I enjoyed being able to play with those children, play therapy had a deeper reason to occur. Children, especially when they're nonverbal, are really playing out their life experience in how they play. It is just wonderful to watch children in their play and really see what's going on in their life. And so play therapy is a wonderful form with children when they're not able to verbalize. to express wherever their emotion and intensity is in their life. And so I found that to be very beneficial. In children, their more visceral emotional responses sometimes come out in their play. Some parents may have walked in the room when I was playing with children on the floor and wondered where their money was going and whether their insurance was being cheated. Yeah, I was having a good time, usually, but also I was joining the child in their world. And that makes a huge difference. The response, when someone feels too pressured, at times they avoid. And one of the things you'll find when you're talking to people in trauma is sometimes certain kind of trauma we tend to avoid.
Or if we can't avoid, we'll sometimes shut down.
Yeah, very much. 2 days after Helen and I were married, 55 years ago, my brother, who was 16, was suddenly killed in a freak electrocution accident. Well, that had us going through our wedding in Anderson and then going 3 hours north to where my parents lived and going to a funeral the next day. Well, that was a trauma that all of us experienced. But as you know, in working with trauma and grief, for many of you, one of the real issues is how each person in the family deals with their grief differently. My father, being a minister in the Church of the Brethren, didn't feel like he had other avenues in which to share and to talk about the trauma. So he wanted to talk about my brother's death more within the family. I had a brother-in-law, a wonderful man, Jim, who didn't like to cry publicly, but was dealing with the trauma of my brother's death like the rest of us, pretty intensely. And so for several years, it was hard for him to be around the family at some gatherings because of my dad's need to share about the grief and his need to not. Now, that's how anxiety affects all of us. And one of the things we look at then is what do we do with different people's needs in dealing with anxiety? And how can we respond to each person without stereotyping what they need to do?
And it's important to remember that there is no right or wrong way to deal with things. There's productive and unproductive.
Yeah. And so sometimes it's trying to, instead of guessing at how someone needs to deal with it, we need to look at that in a different way. So many traumas may be repressed to avoid the pain. And that's why over the years of doing therapy, I worked with a lot of adults, sometimes in their 60s and 70s and 80s, who needed to go back and rediscover into conscious form the kind of trauma they experienced as children that had been repressed, and because it had been repressed, significantly affected them their whole life long.
This is especially prevalent in survivors of sexual assaults. That's why a lot of times you will see people years later that will finally get to a point where they feel safe enough to re-experience it. And that's where they'll start to rediscover the sexual abuse that occurred previously.
And that's pretty common. It's The brain, the mind has a wonderful way of letting us survive. One of the most intense forms of that is when I've dealt with people who have dissociative conditions, often called multiple personality disorder in the past. But when they would even develop other kinds of aspects to their memory that were almost cut apart from the conscious memories of the core personality. So there's a number of ways the mind copes with that kind of traumatic stress in childhood. And when it does, it affects how we live all the rest of our life. Any questions on that? Comments? Cynthia, you have a lighthearted story to share about how play reveals a loss that has impacted my 6-year-old. Would you do that?
My children were in a Montessori school, and my 6-year-old son was in a classroom where they thought there had been some sexual issues happening in the bathroom. And this was a charter school, so it wasn't private. All the emails were flying between parents. So there was a child psychologist who had a child there, and I stopped her when we were moving through the school and asked her, my son was in that class, how could I help him talk to me if there had been a problem? And she said, really just get in there close with him, cuddle more, play games with him, just spend a lot of concentrated time with him and it will spill out. And so we did that for just probably a half a day. It was pretty quick. And I was snuggling with him the next morning before he went to school, and he said, Mom, I have to tell you something. And I thought to myself, oh no, oh no, oh no. And he said, the other children get Pop-Tarts for lunch and I want some too.
That's wonderful.
And boy, I went and got some Pop-Tarts right away.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. But again, it's all about making that connection and making him feel safe and being able to be there on his level.
And a key difference, Cynthia, too, is that what is a trauma to some is not at all a trauma to others. And until we really give an opportunity for them to share, we really don't know that.
And some of those traumas that we think, oh, that's not a big deal. Well, for that individual, it might be a big deal. And it may have issues that continue on. That's why we have to allow them the space and security to share.
What I greatly appreciated is you created a safe environment, Cynthia.
Yeah. It makes one wonder if we're not giving out enough Pop-Tarts.
Yes, I agree. I agree.
You know, I don't see anything wrong with giving out more Pop-Tarts. I'm in.
And giving the opportunity for them to express that they want it.
Absolutely.
That's to find out what is most important in that child's life. When we look at children today, most children that I saw over the years did not have much opportunity to share. It is easy for parents or adults to be too busy or to simply assume that they know what is important in the life of that child instead of giving what you gave, and that is an opportunity to finally express it. That's very important. Another issue we'll look at later, but over the years, because I've always seen a lot of children, and I was also a consultant to our local elementary school social workers. And so they knew me well and often referred to me. At the beginning of each school year, I would often get kindergarten, first graders who were having school phobias, were in school, crying, couldn't adjust. And so
separation issues, especially
separation issues. So I would end up seeing them on an emergency basis in my office And what I primarily did was to say to the mom, who usually was the primary caregiver, do you want Johnny to be in school, don't you?
While Johnny is in the room.
While Johnny's in the room. And usually, because that was such a poignant question, the moms had difficulty saying, I'd rather him not. So the moms would agree with me. And once Johnny looked at his mom, who said, I want you to be in school, I would emphasize that again. And then the next day, Johnny had no problem in school. And I saw the mom for her separation anxiety for a period of time.
Along those same lines, an example that here in Indiana, school started about midway through last month. And that includes our Head Start facilities. And I happened to be at one of the facilities day one when they were coming in. And there was a young man that was crying and crying and crying. And apparently it was grandma that was with him. And she took him aside and said, hey, I want you to go into that school. Why you need to stop all this crying? What about your brother, Sam? Where is he? He's in school. What about your sister, Rachel? Where's she? She's in school. Well, you need to be in school too to learn so that you can be prepared for life. And that really seemed to resonate for that child that, not only is it something that my caregiver wants for me, but also it is the normal within our family.
Yeah. Thank you. Go ahead.
So some potential differences in the experience of stress. Are you ready for that?
Yeah.
Differences in the experiences of stress between adults and children. So processing a significant tragedy such as the loss of a loved one. As adults, we have had more life experience. So hopefully we have been able to develop more coping mechanisms and more social supports that help us to experience those significant traumas, whereas a child just hasn't had the opportunity to create those yet. And so say the passing of a significant loved one within the family, it'll strike everyone as hard, but it may strike the child as especially hard because they're unfamiliar with what's going on to some extent, and they haven't figured out how to deal with those feelings that they have. Some common stressors experienced by adults and children, like pandemic. I know during COVID, during lockdown, the adults and children were dealing with it significantly different. I know that some of the stress for the adults was the kids weren't in school and the adults had to help them. But for the child, the stress would come as I am not getting the chance to build these social connections with my peers. And so it can retard their progress in developing in this area. So other common stressors that could happen: war, immigration, disasters, including climate-related disasters, changing family dynamics, so a divorce in the family or something like that. All of those will be experienced by everyone in the home, but they will be experienced differently. There are also differences in developmentally appropriate stress. So adults will be expected to have more stress regarding work, relationships, that type of situation. Whereas children, their stress is more likely to come from their development of life skills and developing relationship skills. So this will be problems in school. Okay, you're not figuring out how to do arithmetic. You're having trouble with that. Or, the Mean Girls clique is bothering you. They're learning how to develop some of those skills.
We all probably have stories that we can share about how children in your congregation or in your family have reacted to grief, whether that's a grandparent, a parent. Over the years, I've worked with a lot of those children who the adults were so involved in their own grief that they really were not very sensitive to the quiet child in the corner, or to the child who reacted to their grief by acting out. And then some of the adults around would punish the acting out behavior instead of understanding that that was the child communicating their level of stress and their level of anxiety in their own life. Another experience I had in the 80s, I was a consultant to the juvenile probation department for 6 years and helped develop some treatment facilities for that program. And we had a 6-month program where children, these adolescents, would stay in group homes. And for a lot of them, it was not that they were purposefully delinquent. A lot of them were dealing with other issues in their life, often family issues, that caused them to be delinquent. And sometimes what I found with adolescents is the adolescent was perhaps the healthiest person in the family and was acting out to bring attention to the whole family dynamics. And when we, the others in the family, would join in family therapy, it really allowed us to get to some core issues that often stop the delinquent behavior of the adolescent. So but a lot of that was sometimes trauma or death with other family members. Some of you have had contact, like I, with children who have lost a sibling. And all of a sudden, that trauma of losing a sibling just became overwhelming. And especially when everyone else was grieving and no one was paying really good attention to what was going on in their emotional state.
Well, it's also important to keep in mind each individual is different in how they express it and how they feel it. An example is growing up, had a wonderful church community. But if there was a death in the family, they'd always try to provide meals to the family. But because it was cheaper, they'd always bring ham. Well, to this day, I still don't eat pork products very much because I associate it with death. As a child, my experience of it was ham equals death. So you have to understand that a child may experience it differently, and you have to be able to meet them at their level.
Yep. And I did not understand what was going on with that ham on our table for a number of years. But those kinds of things make a difference, because when, we make that connection of cause and effect, then we develop some learning that may not always be accurate. So we may want to talk more. And if those of you who have questions about how grief affects children, that's a wonderful topic as well, and really needs to be looked at, because all of us have dealt with family members where children experience death and we assume that they just were going to be fine. But the emotional connections to other things, even like ham, can be life-changing.
There's the good Protestant idea of you just push forward and suck it up and move on, and the hard work will get you through. That's awesome until it doesn't work. And for some people, that's just not possible. And so we need to find out how we need to help them in those situations.
Yeah. Another thing is, as adults, we depend on other adults around us to communicate, and we pick up on the cues of others as to how we can relate. Who gives permission then to children to communicate in various ways? And as I was stating, a lot of times children relate through their behavior. That says what's going on emotionally. And for so many children, they've gotten into difficulty with the adult community around them, whether that's in a school, in a family, or neighbors, because they were reacting to some emotional issues, and others blamed them then for the way they manifested what they were dealing with. We can look, and we're going to be looking at all of those kinds of life-changing events. We're going to be looking more in depth with the pandemic. I think all of you have had, as I have, great concern for the children in Ukraine and in Gaza, and how this war experience, continual, ongoing experience, is going to affect them the whole rest of their life. We know that a lot of the people who were involved in ISIS in the last 20 years were probably children who grew up in a war zone and then perceived certain others, like the US, as being their enemy. And so that affected how they lived out all of their adult life. Some of you, like I, have moved to a new school when you were growing up. My dad being a minister, there were 3 moves to new schools. And, I can think back to whether that was traumatic or positive. And I can connect to both of those life experiences. But for some, the trauma of that new school and not being able to make a connection there has been negative and life-changing. What we're going to have, whether you believe in global warming or not, we sure see the effects of the change in climate. And children who have gone through the effects of climate change.
Whether it's the result of having the devastation of a hurricane and having to deal with all of your possessions and all of your friends and family are scattered for a while, or whether it comes down to the fear of a forest fire in the area may affect you and make you and your family have to flee from that. Unfortunately, everywhere in the US right now, there is some sort of climate issue that's gotten worse, regardless of what its cause is. And these are definitely stressors that children interpret in a different way.
And we talked about, and we'll continue to look at how changes in the family affect a child's perception of the world and the safety of that world. And many of you, like myself, have worked with many children who have gone through family divorces, especially when those divorces have not been congenial
or amicable.
Amicable, and have caused, have put them in the middle of a very hostile situation where you either love mom or you love dad, but you better not let either one know you love them both. And so children have learned how to walk a tightrope between 2 warring parties and somehow survive that. There's some wonderful books that I've seen over the years. Now, since I'm old, some of those books are old. There was a book called Boys and Girls, book about divorce. And in one of the chapters in that book did a wonderful job of talking about you are never the cause of your parents' divorce. Your parents' divorce happened because they didn't like each other for whatever reason.
Right.
But for so many children, particularly 10 and under, it's easy for them to see themselves as the center of the universe, and everything goes around them.
Good or bad.
Good or bad. Yep. And so when parents divorce, I have witnessed many children whose perception of the world is, look what I did to my parents. And they've needed to understand that this is not something they caused. They are the victim. They are not the perpetrator of this negative event. And that's been a very important thing for kids to understand. So often, our assumption that we don't need to say it to kids because they will already know it, because we know it, is wrong. And what I found is when I shared that with many kids after a divorce who came in my office, you could see by their smile and their deep breath that it resonated.
Likewise, I previously worked in foster care and reunification of families, and working with these foster kids, it was amazing how many times I would have to tell the child, it is not your fault that your parent did this to you. You are not the cause. You are the victim in this situation, because almost, I would say at least 90% of the time, especially for younger children, they assume that, oh, I got hit because it was my fault. Well, no.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we'll be looking a little more too at milestones and how certain milestones get interrupted. We'll especially look at that when we deal with COVID more. That these milestones then, if we just assume that this milestone in the child's life will rector itself and work out without our purposeful assistance, that's a wrong concept. And then social development as well.
So common factors and stressors that can contribute to anxiety. So these would include universal stressors, as we talked about. So some historically, if you can think back in your own family, I think everyone has a story of how the Great Depression affected their loved ones in the past, or how World War II, or even Black Death is still affecting us to this day as far as certain aspects. So you have to think that recent or current stressors such as COVID, housing crash of 2008, wars like Ukraine, Gaza, and climate change, how these are going to affect the younger generation that is dealing with them right now. And again, universal stressors apply to everyone regardless of age, but can be experienced and interpreted slightly differently based on developmental level and previous life experiences. Again, the housing crash of 2008, if for those people that lost their house, if you're an adult at that time and you lost the house, you may experience it as the bank had put us in a bad position and I couldn't keep up with the bills, and you may experience it more as a personal failure. Whereas with a child, they may experience it as a holistic trauma. We were kicked out of our house and everything has changed now.
How, when you think back, who taught you coping skills? Was it in the family? Was it in the church? Grandparents? In many life situations, kids do not learn coping skills very well. And so certain kinds of traumas that may be minor to some become quite major to others because they've not been taught how to cope in the midst of that life experience. It's hard to imagine how prolonged stress, like we talked about in Ukraine or Gaza, is affecting those children and will be forever. But we don't have to be children in those war-torn areas to experience ongoing stress. that doesn't seem to go away.
So, I'm not sure if all of you are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy, but he came up with this system basically talking about how in order to develop appropriately, you have to have certain needs met before you can move on to the next level. So first things first, the physiological needs. If you're not getting the food, water, shelter, and clothing and sleep that you need, your life is going to be focused on that, and you're not going to be able to learn anything higher processing. And so you're going to wind up stuck on that. An example of that is, again, when I was working in foster care, it was not uncommon for kids or for me to hear from the foster parents that the kids are hiding food. And I would tell them that's normal because they come from a home in which food may not be a dependable resource. And so when they find that there is food, they're going to squirrel it away and hide it so that they know when that shortage comes, they have some. I always tell them it will just take some time of them understanding that food is going to be reliably available to them before they start to feel secure and able to stop that behavior and move on to the next step, which would be the safety and security level. And that is where you're more focused on your health, employment, property, family, and social abilities. And so this would be some of the more common. Am I going to continue to have a job? Am I going to get the health care I need? Those types of things would be involved in that.
Is my family system going to be consistent enough for me not to have to worry continually, even how my parents are responding and whether they're going to be there for me?
Absolutely. And so if you can get a sense of your family and social circles are sort of stable, and you feel safe that you're not going to be booted from your home imminently, and you have a reliable source of income, you can then move on to the love and belonging. So this would be where you develop the friendships and the family intimacy and the sense of connection. So this is really where you start developing some of those higher order functions.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're able to do that successfully, then you move on to the self-esteem building, where you develop the confidence within those friendships and family. And then if you have built a good sense of self-esteem, you're able to get to that self-actualization, which is amazing. But unfortunately, most of us spend a lot of our time in the physiological needs, safety and security, and maybe into the love and belonging. It's where a lot of us spend our time, because you have to make sure that you have all of those in place before you can actually start working on what it is that will bring you the sense of inner esteem.
Cindy, you asked a good question on how do you feel about children attending funerals? And that would be a good conversation for us all to have, since I was often, when Adam and his brother and sister were younger, was often at work 13 hours a day. Helen, my wife, would take the kids to funerals when significant people in our lives died. And I feel, Adam, to have to say whether that was a trauma for him, but we came out with some very interesting questions. One of the kids once asked, they were only 3 foot tall because they saw him in the casket. I think it was Adam who, maybe at 4, when Helen was walking away from having greeted the family, he looked up at her and said, "Did you kill him?" And she said, "No, why do you say that?" And he said, "Well, you said you were sorry." So kids draw conclusions that need to be talked about, but I think it was very helpful for them to be in that situation. And then the most important thing is to have ongoing discussion about it, so that that is seen as a normal part of living, not a trauma. But again, I think the impact, Cindy, of that is how is the family dealing with it? And
yeah, I know some people that feel like it's too much for children, but I agree with you. I think it's a good way for them to process that and to learn more about it and become more accepting of that as natural.
yes,
Absolutely. And it's a opportunity for you to help them develop some of those life skills in a safe situation, in safe setting.
yeah.
I also see that we have some comments about the transmission of trauma through generations, which is absolutely something that happens. There has been research that has shown that if a mother experienced a higher level of stress while pregnant, it is an increased probability that that child that is born will also then experience anxiety issues. And that's just from when the mother's pregnant, not when. So, for the example I was given, the Jewish families who are dealing with the traumas of their grandparents during the Holocaust, that is absolutely because the parents never felt that sense of security during that time. They came to the US, they may still have not been able to develop that sense of security for whatever reason. And so the children then never quite feel entirely secure, and that can continue on down, preventing the ability to reach some of these higher levels of self-actualization and self-esteem, because they're always in that constant fear state.
And I think whether it's the anti-Semitic attitudes that some Jewish families experience today in the United States, or if we deal with the Black community and the trauma of the past that they've experienced and their perception down through the years of how that affects their family and affects them. You know, our reality and their reality is different. And what we need to be aware of is not to minimize the reality that has taken place, but to be able to look at what is that perception and how do we deal with that perception more realistically.
Brian and Kimberly, did you have something you wanted to include and share?
I was going to respond to Cindy's comment and just say that I oftentimes try to honor what children are saying. So my sister's, so my niece had said that she wanted to attend a funeral that was important to her. And my sister did not want to deal with her own emotions or how hard it would be. And so she did not let my niece go. And I was like, darn it, I would have gone with my niece and been my niece's person. But, you know, so anyway, I try to believe when my child tells me something. Or I try to give her time to sit with it and decide what feels comfortable or what, and then honor that. And I guess I would, then we were talking about generational trauma, and I really appreciate you talking about the cortisol response in utero and how impactful that is. Oh goodness, lost the thought about war and trauma. That I appreciate you were talking about like how we meet kids where they are, and we, you know, like the Pop-Tart example, and there's some really neat, there was a video that I was trying to find the link to about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and how that's really this very kind of white colonial approach, and it still has some, you know, a good bit of validity today, and yet there's some really healthy ways that other cultures teach us about communal identity, and that communal identity, that the top of the triangle we might be distorting, like not as whole humans, because we keep thinking of those top two tiers as so individualistic, and cultures that teach us about wholeness and being known and being, that my well-being is wrapped up in your well-being, Ubuntu, those kinds of things, may actually form healthier individuals and societies. So just thought I'd add in those pieces.
You are absolutely correct. And those Maslow was working from an American perspective, which was very much the white individualistic idea. What is determined as that top tier can always be cultural in its nature. And so for some, that family dynamic and how we begin to function as a family may be the top tier. And so you are absolutely correct in that level.
One of the things we want to deal with, Mary Eller shared two college roommates who had grandparents fleeing Germany and Poland, and I was witness to the emotions they experienced each time a tornado siren went off in eastern Iowa. The trauma of the second generation is very real. When we learn how to, from that generational anxiety, some things continue.
And we as social animals, we learn from each other. And so some of these anxieties that come in, if I'll use Indianapolis for an example, since that's where I live. Indianapolis is currently dealing with a large number of Haitian immigrants. And so they have specific traumas that they have been going through in the process of moving to the US. And so some of those can actually get absorbed into the community and be community stresses. And so how do we as a community learn how to function with these?
One of the things that you raised, how do we get stuck on certain traumas, and where can we help move on? To reach those final two stages, you've got to have the perspective of not having that tunnel vision that locks us in to the immediate traumas, to the immediate issues in our life. We've got to somehow make what seems to be major at times minor. And the only way to make some of those minor is to be able to make them conscious, first of all, and then to have a safe environment to be able to talk about them, so that we realize that we have many more options in how to cope with that, and we aren't left in a position of just powerlessness. In a little later, as we discussed, we're going to talk about some programs that work on what I call choice awareness, which helps us to look at the many choices we have in our life, because it's easy in trying to cope with trauma to get that view that we only have one response or maybe two, and we keep going back and forth between them and neither one works. And then we want to increase those options so that we can feel empowered. When I work with the mental health court, we have a number of people who have had multiple felonies, often drug-related as well, but also mental health concerns. And as we deal with those people and they go through a couple years, at least half of them graduating from the court system and living very productive lives, we work at how to help them to perceive that there are so many other avenues of responses that allow them to feel empowered. So we're continually talking about how to empower that individual to go from where they feel stuck and unsafe to a place where they feel empowered to make a variety of choices that can take them away from that anxiety. I'm aware of the time, and we wanted to have a break so that some of you can do other things that are important at this point, whether that's getting more coffee or unloading the coffee you already have. So we're going to take, Enton, you said about a 5-minute break?
Yeah, do you think 5 minutes will be enough for us to stretch and move around?
I think so. Yep.
Okay.
Take a 5-minute break and come back.
I'll set a timer up on your screens. Feel free to just mute your mics and mute your cameras if you want to, and come on back in 5 minutes.
Eric raised a very good question. It would be interesting to hear your thoughts regarding how the gospel can help to break the chain of trauma being handed down through generations, leading to multi-generational sin. Also connecting what you are teaching today with regeneration in Christ. Excellent statement. One of the things, the church is not always helpful in helping children understand how to be imperfect. It is so easy for children to try to model the perfection that especially some parents expect, and sometimes the church, and how they respond to misbehavior. Those of you like myself who have had the wonderful opportunity of teaching children in Sunday school understand that some of the most brilliant and creative of our youngsters may also challenge some of our order we would like in that setting. How are children allowed to be who they are? How are they affirmed? Do we need to, in the church, correct, or is our primary duty as Christians to affirm the worth and value of those children we're with? And so I have seen many children from church backgrounds. I got a lot of referrals from churches over the years because the ministers in town understood I was active in a church. But some of those children did not have such positive experiences in the life of the church because they felt chastised, they felt they were not good enough, instead of feeling valued no matter what their behavior was.
It's important to know that the only perfect being is Christ. He didn't expect us all to be perfect, and he loved us because we're imperfect. Kids have a hard time understanding that aspect because we're striving to be more Christ-like. They think that means we have to be perfect. Mm-hmm. And the truth is that's not going to happen. So we have to allow them to be imperfect as we all grow and mature to a level of showing God's love to everyone.
Any questions on that? If you have any questions or comments, please.
Absolutely. If someone has a different perspective, please feel.
I do have a question. You know, like all of us, we're imperfect. We're not going to be perfect, but we do strive to get closer. And how's the best way to deal with that with children when they do misbehave?
Okay.
And so that they know that they're accepted, but their behavior is not acceptable.
Yeah, great question, Cindy. What I see with children is when we correct, are we addressing the behavior or do they feel we're addressing them personally? It's important to address behavior, but there's so many times the child interprets that as I'm bad, not my behavior. And how we go about communicating the very infinite worth of that child while saying, let's see if we can tweak this.
It's also important to take a step back and understand that behavior is trying to tell you something else, because a lot of children aren't able to verbally explain what their needs are or what is going on. They will often act out. And so we might have to take a look if a child is, say, stealing food from the kitchen, maybe that's them saying, I didn't get enough at dinner, or this isn't to my liking, or something along those lines. We can try to meet them where they're at and help them through that experience.
I know my parents were very quick to lay down the law, when I was a kid. And so I tend to be sometimes a little more rash than or angry than I would like to be when I'm dealing with kids. And so I have to really push myself to not react with anger and try to, just take a breath.
Yeah.
And explain that's not the way you do it.
Yeah. And one of the things we have to do as parents is learn to forgive ourselves as well. Because about the time I thought that having a Ph.D. in psychology and all those years of experience made me a better parent, I was humbled regularly and had to regularly ask for Adam and his brother and sister to forgive me because my reaction was not fitting what had happened.
I think that's very important that you do ask for forgiveness and say you're sorry to kids, because my parents never would ever have done that.
I see so many parents who say, well, now somehow that would undermine my strength.
Right.
Well, it doesn't. It communicates something different.
And we want to extend God's grace to these children so that they can understand it. But part of that also means we have to extend it to ourselves. And we have to be willing to accept that I made a mistake. This is what it is. I can learn from this and move forward so that hopefully hopefully I can do better the next time.
Another question. I would appreciate a discussion about how to empower kindergartners, first, second graders to feel safe after they've been traumatized by intruder drills that have been experienced in the classroom. This has disrupted our grandson's life. That's in the very things we use to try to keep people safe. We have to be aware of how to do that with understanding the capacity of that age child to understand all the dynamics involved. And that to have a drill does not mean we're going to have a tornado or an invader in our school. It does mean we have to prepare for all scenarios. And I don't think probably the school or parents are doing a very good job in helping children understand this is a very rare thing that could occur, but we have to prepare for everything. And this is one of those things we need to prepare for. We make the assumption that the kids are interpreting it the same way we adults are. And we miss the conversation and asking the questions that would help them to have a better sense of what's really going on.
And if they have been traumatized by this, it would be a good opportunity to allow them to express exactly what it is that they're feeling as a result of this. Are they constantly afraid of what's going to happen? And if so, then this is where you can talk about how rare it is. If it is it, especially for some children that have sensory issues, is it the loud noise itself of the drill that may be causing problems? I think we've got a question from Rick and Bev we'll get to, and then we've got a couple more in the chat here.
Well, I just had a comment, something to share. Recently, we had a tragedy in the church where a grandpa was tragically killed in an automobile accident. It was very sudden, unexpected. And when I went to visit the family, what I noticed was the son, being the oldest and the son in the family, was very, I'm taking charge, I'm okay, I'm not going to show any emotion. Yeah. And I saw it in his son, the 10-year-old boy off in the corner. And instead of acting out, what this young man did was just become very reserved.
Mm-hmm.
He pulled his hoodie up over his head and put his arms on the table and just kind of looked down, but didn't show any emotion.
Yeah.
And this went on probably for about an hour while I was there and talking with the family. And finally, I went over to the young man and I said, can we go in the other room for a second and talk just around the corner? And when we did, we sat down at the table and I said, I just noticed, I can tell you're experiencing something very stressful. And I want you to know this is a safe place. And you don't have to say a word, but please feel free to express how you're feeling. And the young man didn't say a word, but he just began to cry.
Oh, yes.
And he just sat there and cried for about 15 minutes. And following that, just such a sense of relief on the young man, And I thought about how
safe and loved.
How many times we misread the being quiet and being reserved. It's easy to see the acting out as needing as a call for help, but we tend to overlook the very quiet, reserved. That can be just as much a call for help.
Yeah. What you picked up on, and we really haven't dealt with a lot until now, is nonverbal communication. That so many times we've got to pay more attention to the nonverbal than the verbal, because that nonverbal behavior is communicating a lot. And that young man was probably trying to model being a male like Dad. I'm going to be stoic. I'm going to take care of everyone else instead of address. It's very good, Bev. Thanks.
Yeah.
Which, go ahead, Adam.
So Eric has put a comment in here. I realize we are primarily discussing anxiety in children, but are adults really much different? I see many adults who act like children in the way they respond to things, not trying to put them down, but because they haven't developed better skills, they are still children who just got older. Yes, absolutely. As we go through these stages of development, we can get stuck in any one of them. And in doing so, what happens is, even though we may grow older, our mindset is still stuck as, say, a 6-year-old or an 8-year-old, wherever that trauma was that we couldn't get past. And so you will see a lot of this with some adults that really can't communicate and express their feelings well. You'll see a lot of name calling, putting down, projection of behaviors. All of this would be something that you'd expect to see out of a 7-8-year-old. But these people this is where they stop developing, and so that they continue on with that behavior.
So what we deal with, that's why when I dealt with a lot of adults in counseling, we had to go back to some of those early traumas that locked them in to certain kinds of coping skills that were maladaptive, and to relearn that.
Absolutely. Any further questions before we jump back into the PowerPoint?
Okay, we'll let you get back into that.
Go.
I see one more.
Go ahead.
One more question. Go ahead, Cindy.
I wonder if I could just speak to what's been said just a minute ago. I think that sometimes we forget that presence in ministry is more important than words. And I think even with children, that's true.
Yes.
When you're a little child, I was only 12, but the story that changed my life and made me a minister was how I was treated by a pastor who literally just noticed me in the corner and said, "Do you want to talk about your grandmother?" Yes. And the thing is, I didn't have words. I remember feeling stupid because I didn't, but I also felt love.
Yes.
And I moved from there, and he also took my hand and walked me across the graveyard after we had to put her in the ground. So I want us as pastors to realize, especially with teenagers, that because I've worked a lot with them, and I think people are afraid of teenagers because they don't always respond to us and give us signals that what we do matters. But sometimes it really is just what the person was saying about just noticing and saying, I'm I'm here for you. Maybe you don't know how you feel right now, but if you want to talk, I'm here.
What I appreciate, Cindy, is that you didn't push for you weren't pushed for words. You were allowed to be with a presence, and the presence of someone who you knew cared was all you really needed.
Mm-hmm.
The words can come later.
And it happened to my son at the funeral of his grandfather that he saw the woman across the room who was his pastor. And I said, should we go over and talk to her? And he said, no, she's been watching me. She's coming over to me.
Excellent.
Yeah. Kids read our feelings much better than adults do.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, those are just being able to be a presence. I have had a number of people over the years who have said, John, I couldn't do what you do because you know the book of tricks or whatever. And I don't. I understand true empathy. I understand that there's a lot of things I don't know. And my best friends have told me that the only way that I could get the 12 hours of therapy I needed a day was to be a therapist and get it from the clients I worked with. The one thing that I've said to everyone I've seen when in my 49 years as a therapist is that you need to understand that I only see the healthiest people in the community because it takes tremendous guts to come talk to a turkey like me. And when people understood how real that is for me, we got through a whole lot of hours of rapport building and down to some real good work.
Absolutely. Some other factors and stressors relating to early childhood. So these would include developing trust in relationships. Some complications to this include if there's conflict between the parents, the child can have trouble developing a sense of trust within relationships. Likewise, if there's instability, say a family is homeless and they're having to move every couple of months, they never build that sense of permanency. There's also developing new skill sets. So some complications can be parental style. So this would be punitive versus affirming, logical versus emotional, and etc. And we'll talk about this a little bit further in a minute. And then there's the outside the home issues. So these can be disputes in the church or in the neighborhood, learning different rules and schedules for different environments. I especially see this with the pre-K kids. They're used to a certain schedule at home, and this is their first experience outside of the home. And so, especially the first couple of weeks, they are going through a lot of stress learning that we have a set schedule for them to achieve certain things.
Yeah. Who touches the life of the child? We've talked about parents, grandparents, caregivers, extended family in the church, the school. And each of those people then are significantly important and teach either adaptive or maladaptive behaviors in dealing with trust and relationship and how to cope with stress. How consistent and affirming are the expectations across those individuals? It's been really interesting over the years when I deal with children. I can say to the child, what are mom's rules and what are dad's rules? And they can clearly tell me the difference. And they know who they can push and how many times they can ask for a snack before they get it. So kids are far wiser than adults in understanding what the rules are. And we sure know that for many of us as grandparents, that the rules of grandparents and the child understanding us versus their parent is dramatically different. And they read us quite well. What conscious messages are communicated. And we're going to talk some more about some kind of parenting books that have been out and what those communication skills are, and whether they're consistent or whether they're inconsistent over time. Did you want to? No, go ahead and go. Okay. One of the things we look at is how different environments send different messages. It's interesting how many kids may have had inconsistency, for instance, at home, but then they don't have the same acting out behaviors at school because they understand more clearly what the consequences are. And if we look at some of the kind of parenting books, there's one I'm going to bring up later by Dinkmeyer and McKay called this A Systematic Training for Effective Parenting. And what that parenting book basically says is consistency is what matters. Whether you're more lenient or more strict is not the issue. The issue is, are you consistent, and do the kids feel safe within whatever the structure of the rules are? And that's a key factor. So when you deal with parenting books, some of you who are old like me sure remember Heimgenocht back in the 50s, and then Thomas Gordon and PET in the 60s and 70s. And then there's Dinkmeyer and Gordon, and we can go on. And there's a number of books written on parenting. But the key to a lot of that book, or those books, is, do we have unconditional love? And do we have reflective listening in our communication? And reflective listening is simply trying to help the child hear that we understand what they're saying. Reflective listening's pretty easy if you understand this is dialogue, not monologue. And it is difficult to get some adults to dialogue with children.
I had a supervisor at one point that gave me a great phrase. It said, God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth, so you should listen twice as much as you talk.
So there's some very basic things in communication that a number of years ago, I was on the state committee, that goes back 45 years, to try to get a parenting class, which basically is a communication class in every high school as a required class. Well, we didn't get it done, but some classes in psychology or home ec even have worked at parent communication and how to train parents to be better parents. You know, of all the things in life that we get trained to do, that's the one we get less training in. We are to adapt to whatever model our parents or those we observe around us have, instead of clearly, consciously being trained as parents.
So we're going to break down some of the groups into age for specific factors and stressors that are specific to them. You have to keep in mind that these could affect children of all ages, but there's certain ones that are most likely to hit particular ages. So school environment, again, that's going to hit children that are all in school, but especially young children as they're just starting to get into school. So this would be them dealing with classwork for the first time, with bullying, with developing relationships and friendships. These are some specific stressors for that age range. Additionally, you have parental pressures and expectations. So the child previously may not have had many expectations, but once they get into school, they either consciously or unconsciously pick up that, hey, mom and dad expect me to make A's or B's or something along those lines. And so it may apply additional pressure. Or if, say, dad's always talking about his football success as a young child, the child may also pick up that stress and say, oh, my dad's trying to say I need to become a great football player, for example. Likewise, you also have family dynamics. So sibling rivalries and conflicts. These are things that, again, I think even as you become an adult, you can probably think of situations in which you had sibling rivalries. But this is especially important for young children because they don't have the skill set yet to understand how to handle it appropriately. Additionally, there's internal expectations. So these may not be anything that's transmitted externally, but these may be things that the child picks up on their own. So they may, for example, you tend to have some children that just tend to be more driven and tend to put more pressure upon themselves, regardless of the situation. This is a scenario in which they are applying that personal pressure.
When we look at school environment, a number of years ago, the superintendent of Anderson Schools pulled me in as a consultant to work with a school after a junior high young man committed suicide. And what I became aware of is a program that I was thankful to hear about, and that is whenever there's social media within the school, they had the ability to have flagged words that if they came up on social media, the school counselor or social worker would bring the student in and try to find out whether there were other issues, whether that was violent issues or violence towards self. But they then were able to monitor those things better. We know some of the school shootings, that those things have been done in other corporations as well, to varying effectiveness. We're going to look at later some proactive kinds of programs. One of them that Anderson school system has that fits with Being Brethren is a program they have for kindergarten through second graders called Peacemakers, which teaches kids how to make lots of choices and not feel trapped in their behavior. In some schools, we find that counselors and social workers are working with grief groups or groups around children who have had a divorce in the family or LGBTQ concerns. In parental pressures, one thing we have to look at is, are those pressures conscious or unconscious? For so many parents, they're not aware of the kind of pressure they put on their child to imitate or live out their childhood desires. I see all kinds of parents who wanted to be a star athlete and then put pressure on their child to be that star athlete that they were not. Sometimes when I've been able to identify that with those parents, they've been able to back off and allow that child more opportunity to be who they are. In family dynamics, we see that rivalry between siblings, a child 3 years younger expecting to be as good at a sport as their older brother or sister, not taking into respect the age difference. In internal expectations, it's what do I personally consider to be the marker for success? And is success putting my best effort in, or is success only reaching a certain score in whatever event I'm participating? Or is it, as young children experience, is it always winning the game? And can I be a loser and be okay? What is worth investing my time in? What's the payoff? And children are always weighing that payoff. And, if the payoff is I'm going to be affirmed by my parent, no matter how I do, and by others around, then there's a much more likely chance they will continue in that activity. So it's whatever leads to that sense of self-esteem.
So some factors and stressors for prepubescent and pubescent youth specifically would also include social media. Most of us did not have to deal with this growing up. If we had a bully, we could just go home and the bully was no longer there. Well, now, unfortunately, these children are taking the bullies home with them within social media. So it's a entirely new type of trauma they're having to deal with. They also have to deal with the hormonal changes of puberty. I mean, that is a stressor regardless of who you are. I don't care. Trying to figure out sort of who I am developing into and sort of what my place is going to be. They're also developing additional life skills. So this may be their first job, developing personal confidence to accomplish a goal. Some may be starting to live on their own for the first time, and developing some of these life skills that they need. Additionally, for a lot of prepubescent and pubescent youth, they have the added stress of developing romantic relationships. And so this is creating intimate bonds, developing their own sense of sexuality, whether that is homosexuality, heterosexuality, or just even whether they feel an affinity toward sexual affinity towards other people. This is them developing those senses of themselves.
We're going to be dealing with social media a little more in another slide. But when we look at hormonal, we look at that. How do we deal with developing our self-image when each of us develop puberty at different times? I remember being very short, the shortest one in the class. And so my puberty development was much later. And I remember some of those feelings of feeling like I'm not quite there yet. I'm inferior, and how to help kids live with whatever that label becomes. For me, it was shorty. Then developing life skills. Where's the key developmental moments? Were they traumatic or were they confidence building? And we can help children to develop that sense of confidence at whatever those developmental stages are. And then how were relationships developed? Were they creating confidence or fear and disappointment? And how do we help children and teens to be able to verbalize and move on from that point?
So as we've addressed a little bit, there are genetic or familial factors and stressors. Social or personal expectations based on early environmental or genetic experiences. So this would include racism, unconscious bias, distorted worldview. This would also be where you would see this generational trauma. So if you have, such as the Jewish individuals whose families fled from the Holocaust, or maybe you're dealing with some immigrants that have fled war in their home country. This is where some of those social and environmental factors can really have an additional effect. For some diagnoses, there's also genetic factors that can be found. Just because there is a family history of something does not mean that someone is going to be diagnosed with it, but it can lead to an increased chance. Mm-hmm. So this would include ADHD, bipolar disorder, learning disorders, but it also includes diabetes, heart attacks, certain types of cancer. All of these have a genetic factor to them that can lead to the potential for higher stress, but don't necessarily mean in of themselves that you will develop this.
I don't know how many of you have gone through genetic testing. And I don't know whether 20 years from now, genetic testing will be a part of every newborn's experience. And what we do with that, that's going to be an interesting future. But we can, by looking at genetic testing, if someone has bipolar in the family, we can see whether that they have a predisposition to themselves being bipolar. We sure know that with Huntington's disease, particularly. And we can almost decide at what point the person will develop symptoms because of where the markers are on genetic testing. So there's a number of things, there's an ethical position and discussion about, is genetic testing helpful? And is it going to be used against individuals as they develop? For instance, if insurance companies find out about the genetic testing, will they keep certain people from receiving insurance? So, that's some other kinds of questions we can ask. When we deal with social and personal expectations, is there, where do we learn bias? Is that taught? Is it modeled? Is it within our school systems? We have a lot of debate among a number of states of what should be in our history books and what shouldn't. I have some real concerns about that. And is that going to create a generation of some kids within certain states that have some biases that they wouldn't have had otherwise? Were certain groups of people taught to be unsafe, stereotyped, and who sets the standards for those realities? And are those realities distorted? I don't have answers. I do have a lot of questions.
So factors and stressors related specifically to COVID that we have found, there tends to be a sense of isolation especially within children. This can retard their interpersonal relationship building skills. So this would be these social emotional skills that they need to be able to become fully rounded adults and be able to handle stressors. There becomes a fear of continuing perpetual danger. So you may not feel, and this can be true of the active shooter drills as well. You don't feel necessarily that there's something going to get you right now, but there's this ever creeping sense that danger's just around the corner. Mm-hmm. Additionally, there are the missed developmental milestones. So this can be either personal or educational. Since we're in the state of Indiana, I'll give that as an example. I know they've come out with some reports that just now we are starting to catch back up with children getting to their appropriate reading level after the lockdown, because during the lockdown, the children didn't have the opportunity to have the same kind of engagement with the teacher that helped them develop those reading skills. Mm-hmm. And additionally, there was during COVID, there was an increased family tension, and they found that actually domestic violence went up significantly. That definitely can cause additional stress on the child as well.
In trying to protect children, have we somehow unconsciously denied them basic milestones in development? We know during COVID we did, and that was part of the isolation. But are other things like homeschooling, book banning, the ability or not to meet children from other cultures and religions, retarding development? What happens when a child continues to hear that the world is an unsafe place? And how does that affect them? And as we talked about, even with the shooter drills, does that lock in pervasive anxiety, fear that we don't help the child to work through? What happens to us then as adults? How do we, has COVID increased our fear moving forward? Because if it's increased our fear as adults, it gets communicated to the children around us. So how has COVID affected our children? Of course, missed milestones, educational delays, significant time without peer group interaction, reduced healthy relationship development, increased pervasive fears about the world and the safety of the world around. And as Adam said, increased domestic violence. So what do we do with that isolation, fear that we're dealing with? Well, we're going to continue to look at, and each of you have had different responses to how you feel you can address that.
Again, some factors and stressors connected to social media specifically. Loss of personal relationships. So a lot of, especially children, start to see that, oh, I've got 10,000 followers on my social media, but they don't really have any close interpersonal connections. And so that can be a factor and a trauma for the children, is trying to figure out how to develop those personal relationships. You also have a loss of play and creativity. There is the instant feedback of social media. It's constantly feeding you something all the time. So children lose their sense of, how do I make my own entertainment, or how do I become creative in and of itself for future skills. There's also the unrealistic expectations that are developed as that. As anyone that's been on something, say Facebook, knows, people aren't posting, oh man, I just had the worst day and my car broke down, blah, blah, blah. Everyone's posting their family pics from the vacations and all that. They're all setting up their world to look the best it's ever looked. And unfortunately for children, they start to think that that's what their life should look like all the time. And so it's saying unrealistic expectations. Also, as a result, unfortunately, through media, not just social media, but all media, there has been sort of a hypersexualization of children. You have to look a certain way and behave a certain way to fit in. And these children are taking that information in upon themselves, and it creates an additional stress that I have to meet these expectations. It also has the potential for addiction. The children have a loss of real world interactions and potential decrease in other activities. It becomes social media for some people is the world. That's all they care about anymore. Again, dissemination of potentially harmful material. So this would include pornographic information to young children, extremist material to young children. When they're just forming their sense of identity, they start developing all of these extremist and inappropriate information. And so it can have a lasting impact on them. And it also has, there's the inability to disconnect. There are a lot of, I'll use an example of when I was in foster care working with kids. I was working with a 14-year-old young lady who was being cyberbullied, and it was really having a massive impact on her. And so me not knowing so much about it at the time, I said, well, what if we just get you off social media for a little while? And you'd have thought I shot her. She had the worst reaction to that. And so I had to learn, okay, she can't disconnect. Maybe I have to help her learn some of those disconnect skills, but I also have to teach her how to function within that world, since that's where she's going to be.
One of the things we look at is social media isn't all negative. It's connecting to a greater community. For some who have not been able to develop a group around a common interest in their local environment, they've been able to do that by social media. And so we've been able to find people of similar interests and learn from them as well. But the addictive and negative behavior is sure a significant factor we need to be looking at.
Absolutely. Brian, Kimberly, would you like to make a comment?
Yeah, I see multiple spiritual directors on this call, and one of the things I talk to adults and teens that I see is, instead of it being like a punishment to get off of social media or to read bad news, hard news, is, talk about media fasts as a practice, as just a way of making space for something that's life-giving, maybe it's nature or friend time or whatever. So instead of it being like a punishment, making it an invitation. Now, I just read a whole bunch of bad news late last night and didn't sleep for hours, so I don't always follow my own advice. But it was a good reminder of like, this is why turning off depressing
setting
news
the bedtime limits at like 9 p.m. or
are
whenever
a good thing.
is for both children and for adults.
Yeah. And accepting the grace of, I made that mistake. Let's try to do better next time.
It's a good reminder, Kimberly. Right. But anyway, I was just thinking about ways of being invitational, and we actually really had huge boundaries this summer for our 13-year-old this summer, and we would check in with her. And something that was lovely is that we would say in these oftentimes pretty well worded ways of do the boundaries, how are you feeling about those boundaries, and giving her language to say like, it's kind of freeing. It's nice and it's safe.
It's a relief. That's the phrase that we would often hear say. It actually is a relief to have these boundaries.
Yes.
And so it felt like we got our child back from the unfettered internet access at school. And so, to hear that it was a relief and that she felt safer and that the boundaries were actually welcomed. It was a good reminder to us, but it was a good reminder to her. Yeah.
Most adults forget to check in. They take the time away as if they then can spend more time with themselves, and then there's not that interaction.
What you point out is also a reason why a lot of these tech entrepreneurs are putting their kids in the schools that are tech free. It's so they can learn the boundaries themselves and set those. And so the technology itself is fine. It's knowing how to use it as a tool and not become dependent on it as a way of life.
The other thing you brought up is how much teens want boundaries. When I worked with the juvenile probation system and we put kids in the group home, what we found is those kids function very well within the group home, and within a couple weeks of them being released to go back home, they would act up so they could stay in the group home, because as much as they loved their family, they did not want to go back to the chaos of the family. They wanted structure, and when we could get them to identify that, we could teach them then how to have structure, even though the family wasn't going to provide it. We're aware of time. Do we want to do the survey before?
Let's do that after. How about we take another 5-minute break, and then we will address some of these questions that have come up, and we will do a quick survey, and then we will move on to the final part of the presentation.
Sounds great. 5-minute break, stretch, get up, folks, and see you in 5.
We have a short survey that we'll get to, and then we will start answering some questions that came up and then move on to final part of the presentation. So, Anton, if you want to bring up the first.
There you go. The question is, as a child, which of these options was the biggest source of anxiety for you? And you've got several options there. About half of you have responded so far. Maybe a few people aren't back from break yet, but go ahead and click in. We're only up to 20 out of 30 responses, but maybe we'll cap it there. And
Yep.
Last chance, you got 2 more seconds before I close the poll. And here we go. So let's share these results.
Looks like 41% of people were saying that family was, as a child, family was their biggest stress. That's not a surprise considering how much of our lives is spent with our families, especially at that young age. But it looks like we got a variety of things that were the most anxious developing for people, including school at 27% for people, social interactions for 18%, and extracurricular activities were 14%.
Okay. Move on to next.
Yep.
Okay, here's question number 2. How did your family respond to your stress? Supportively, ambivalently, or inconsistently? I wish I could show all the results as you were clicking on them. Zoom doesn't allow us to do that. But as we get more of your responses, I'll be able to show you the responses that are all coming in. About another 2 seconds for you to decide. And here we go.
So it looks like the largest portion said that their families dealt with stress of the child ambivalently. So,
but that's 40% then.
Absolutely.
About 30% for both the others.
Yep. Just interesting spread there.
Yeah, and sad that so much of it is kind of below the bar.
But yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, as we are working with these families, we need to keep in mind that if I, as a child, learn to deal with that my stress is going to be dealt with ambivalently, I may proceed that off with my child going forward. And that's how you transmit some of these, the stress generationally.
Mm-hmm.
Next question.
Good. Here we go. How supported did you feel as a child by your church family during periods of high stress? Thanks for those of you that are jumping in.
Thank you.
We'll get those results soon. A couple more seconds for those that are still trying to think about where to click. And by the way, if you click one place, you can change your answer if you said, no, that's not right. So here we go.
Looks like the majority of people felt that they were either somewhat supported or very supported within their church family, which is very good. But it looks like, unfortunately, there was still close to 40% that were saying that they either didn't feel supported at all or felt inadequately supported by their church family. So that is really something that we have to be cognizant as we go forward to try to make sure that we are being that support for the children.
And then here's the 4th question.
Okay.
How much support and encouragement did you feel from your own family during periods of high stress when you were a kid?
Nothing popped up.
It's up for the rest of us. Maybe it's still coming or your connection.
There, okay.
So another handful of folks, go ahead and make your choice and then we'll summarize it. And we'll close here in another moment. And here are our results.
Well, it looks like a majority, again, felt somewhat supported or very supported within their family, which is excellent. Unfortunately, that's not everyone's experience, but there is still approximately 40% of people that were saying that either they weren't when they were dealing with stress, their family either wasn't helping them to support them at all, or was not very supportive. So thank you all for sharing.
Okay, you want to get back to?
Yep.
We'll get back to the PowerPoint here.
Adam and John, thanks for all you're doing. And remember, there's a number of things in the chat that we don't want to let escape from us.
Reading some of the questions you were taking notes on the questions.
Yeah.
Even if we save those to the end, we can certainly.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, let's move on here.
Okay.
The one question, the last one, I think, was tools that teachers and pastors can use to counter missed milestones. That's a tough one, because to understand what milestones may have been missed, we need to listen and watch the experience of that child or youth, because they're not going to say to us what they've missed. But in our interaction with them, we will find out what some of those things are. And perhaps in the life of the church, we need to be more involved in maybe groups of children just kind of talking about their life experience through COVID, and see whether in listening to them, we can decipher what some of those life experiences are that we need to address.
We're going to start now moving into interventions and supports, and how we can try to be that sense of support for the families and children. Consistently within mental health journals, research has shown that the number one most important factor in a successful outcome is the therapeutic rapport, even over the type of therapy that's used, or in the level of achievement of the therapist, whether they're a doctorate or a master's level. The number one factor is the rapport you can build. Supporting children, some important steps that would go with developing this rapport would be, you want to be non-judgmental listening. You want to allow the child to express the concerns unled and uninterrupted. Mm-hmm. So you want to make sure that you are allowing them to fully express their experience within the situation. You also want to use open and supportive nonverbal communication. I think everyone knows what it means when you cross your arms and sort of have a scowl on your face. It's kind of like, oh, I don't want to talk to that person. So you want to make sure that you're inviting, especially to children. They pick up on nonverbals a lot more than even adults do. And then you want to acknowledge the acknowledgement of confidentiality. Some kids may not feel like they can open up if they're afraid that the information is just going to go straight to their parents or something like that. Part of acknowledgement of confidentiality is expressing that there are certain things in which you would have to break confidentiality. So if the child is being hurt in some way, you are going to take action to make sure this child is safe. But otherwise, let them know that you are not trying to be a snitch on them. You're just there for them.
One of the questions that was raised was when a parent is in a position of authority, whether that's of a principal or of a minister. My dad was a minister, and sometimes that incorporated certain expectations of how I would behave. And sometimes my dad probably was rather disappointed that my behavior reflected on him. But, it's how do parents allow us to be ourselves in whatever their position of authority is, so that we can have a more normal developmental life. Going to the next one, I think.
So with interventions and supports, how we listen without trying to solve issues immediately. We in the church are very compassionate and want to try to help people whenever we can. The problem is sometimes we impose a solution on someone instead of helping them to find the solution that is best for them. Some steps we can do to try to prevent this is, does this issue have a precipitating event? Be thinking about, does this stem back to a particular trauma or loss? Or is this something that is just nebulous? How is this issue being experienced by the child? Are they having physical manifestations, mental distress? And this can be cultural as well. I'll give you an example. In Chinese culture, it's not appropriate to feel depressed, but it is appropriate to feel sick. And so a lot of times, people that are depressed in China will report an extraordinary amount of sickness. Does this issue involve other people? So does the stressor involve their family members, their friends, their teachers, something like that? Does the anxiety come from worrying about others? So not that it's conflict with others, but they're spending all their time worrying about, oh no, dad says we're having financial problems. Oh no, what are we going to do? Oh no. And then how long has this issue been of concern? So you need to think about, is this something that just started happening? If so, you can maybe work through the issues and help them to move on pretty quickly. If this is something that's been lasting with them for a while, may have to help them process it and start all the way from the point where the trauma occurred and work their way up to finding the appropriate ways of dealing with it.
You know, there's a lot of ways we've learned to cope over the years. I don't know if any of you, like me, when I walked home from school, heard the old adage, step on a crack and you break your mother's back. But I remember being a kid, getting home and running into the kitchen to see if her back was broken. But you know, there's certain things that kids learn, whether in a humorous way or because of certain trauma, and it influences how they view the world. There's a book called, I don't know, I can't see it right now, Systematic Training for Effective Parenting. And in that book, one thing I've liked about it over the last 50 years of teaching a lot of parenting classes is it talked about a number of factors that between good and responsible parents. And that may sound a little trite because we all want to be good parents. But let me go through some of that. A good parent says, I must control, be in charge. Where a responsible parent says, I believe the child can make good decisions. And how do we then help children to make good decisions and to know it's okay to fail at decisions, but in the effect of then feeling self-confident, contributing to self-worth. A good parent, in their statement, is I am superior. So there's a sense of looking down on the child. They overprotect. They may spoil or shame. Where a responsible parent says, I am equal, not more or less worthwhile than you. Age does not make me superior. And a lot of children need to know that. So they develop self-reliance and responsibility. Children learn how to make decisions and feel respect for themselves and others. A third one is I am entitled. You owe me. It's over-concerned with fairness. But a responsible parent says, I believe in mutual respect. They teach the child to respect themselves and others and have trust in other people. A good parent sometimes says, I must be perfect. And we've talked about that. And perfection and the best from all instead of understanding the educational curve, how we all learn. A responsible parent says, I am human. I have the courage to be imperfect. They focus on tasks at hand, not self-evaluation. They see mistakes as challenging to keep us moving in a forward direction. They have the courage to try new experiences no matter how we fail. The last one is I don't count. Others are more important than I, where a responsible parent teaches I believe all people are important, including myself. I think we can probably find some scripture to back that up too. So there's certain parenting books. When I've done parenting classes over the years, I've often used these fun charts from the step book.
So a lot of times when we all get stuck in this, but especially children as they're learning to deal with stress, we get stuck in the I only have these options. It's either A or B. I have to choose. And really, the idea is we want to open that world up. So exploring the range of options and addressing the issue in collaboration with the child is one way that we can help them. So you can help the child to develop the skills to cope and solve the issues they may encounter in the future. So this isn't saying you need to do this. This is working with them to say, what option do you think would work? And you need to allow them the opportunity to fail safely, because we all learn more from our failures than our successes. A matter of fact, I believe it was Thomas Edison, when asked after the light bulb, they asked him, why did it take you 10,000 times? Why did you fail 10,000 times to make a light bulb? He said, I didn't fail 10,000 times, found 10,000 ways not to make a light bulb. It's that reframing of what wasn't your intended outcome can still be a positive in your development. You need to allow the child to feel comfortable about the choices that they choose for their intervention. So you need to it's a collaborative effort. You're not imposing something upon them. You are providing them the opportunity. And then you help the child to expand their repertoire of options. We all get that tunnel vision, and you want to give that example? You're trying to help them expand out in a positive way.
I worked with a young man many years ago who came in because he hit a teacher, and I guess he cursed at a teacher, and he got in some trouble for that behavior. And when he shared it with me, I said, "Way to go, Johnny. Good job." And he said, "What?" And I said, "Now let's look at what your options are. Instead of cursing at the teacher, you could have hit her." And we listed all kinds of other things. And so we got out a piece of paper, and on that paper, we had 30 blank spots, and we listed 30 kinds of things he could have done instead, from walk away to send a variety of nonverbal cues to the teacher. And when he looked at all of those kinds of options, he took a deep breath, and he was able to see that the next time he got angry at the teacher, he could use one of those other responses and just see if any of them worked better.
But you were also able to acknowledge that the choice he made may not have been the best, but it was better than some other options. Yes. And so you affirmed him in that statement, which may be something that some of these children aren't ever getting.
Yeah.
A lot of times it's easy to focus on the negative. And so we focus on, no, don't do that. No, don't do that. Sometimes the positive affirmation can be even more life-changing than the negative.
Mm-hmm.
So some interventions and supports that can happen are professional counseling. This has both positives and negatives. A negative would be the lack of trained therapists and difficulty accessing those available, especially in certain areas. I know a lot of rural areas just have problems with even having qualified therapists in the area. But even in a bigger city, it can be hard to access a therapist because your insurance may not cover it, or you may not be able to get in for 6 weeks or whatever the case may be. So unfortunately, those are things that are negatives that we have to acknowledge. But if professional counseling is needed, we need to encourage and support it. And these could include play therapy. This is mostly done with children that are still developing their verbal skills, as they aren't able to express everything. There's verbal therapy, and this would include such therapies as cognitive behavioral therapy, person-centered, group therapy. These are all different types of verbal therapy. There's family therapy, in which you would deal with the entire support system there. This is especially good when you're working with younger children, because a lot of times what they're responding to with the anxiety is the situation around them. And sometimes by speaking with the parents and addressing some of those other issues, you can reduce the amount of anxiety for the child. There is support groups. For some people, these can be very affirming, just to normalize the behavior, to say, hey, I'm not alone and it's not my fault. And finally, for some people, they need medication to help them. It's not their fault. They just have a imbalance in their brain or something. And sometimes some medication can help them to get on track so that they can then deal.
Some of the kind of support groups that have been very helpful, of course, Al-Anon for kids whose parents have addictive behaviors. One of the frustrating things when I retired from active practice a couple of years ago was that there weren't more young therapists coming in to fill the gap. And many of the people I had seen, it was very difficult to find someone to refer them to. And that's a real issue we deal with at this point.
Yeah, I went one too many. Okay, so we're just going to real quickly go through some anxiety disorders that are fairly common and give their definitions. We don't want to focus on this too much because it would take away from some of our possible interventions, but we want you to be aware of the different types. So like generalized anxiety disorder, per the DSM-5, which is the diagnosis tool that's used for mental health, it's characterized by 6 months or more of chronic exaggerated worry and tension that is unfounded or much more severe than the normal anxiety most people experience. So this isn't necessarily aimed at any one thing. This isn't like this person has a fear of flying. This is an overall sense of anxiety, just
pervasive,
anxious about the entire world. Everything's just makes you a little anxious. Acute stress disorder, per the DSM-5, this occurs after a traumatic event with symptoms that last from 3 days to 1 month. And some of the symptoms can include specific fear behavior, flashbacks, disassociation, anxiety, arousal and avoidance. So it arouses that fear response. These are a lot of times what you think of when you think of someone that just experienced something and they're quote unquote in shock. They may be experiencing some of these, and it may last from a couple days to a month. Post-traumatic stress disorder. This is the more long-term. This occurs after a traumatic event. Sorry, I need to
shrink our faces.
Shrink our faces here. Traumatic event with symptoms that can include, but are not limited to, nightmares, flashbacks, unwanted, upsetting memories, etc. And the symptoms last for more than a month. There's also an effort to avoid stimuli related to the trauma. And there are a number of physical symptoms that can occur as a result. The symptoms create distress or functional impairment. So this is something where it really affects the ability of someone to live a good life and causes ongoing issues. So there was actually an increase in this among children during or shortly after 9/11, where children were traumatized by the experience of seeing all of the death caused in New York and having it shown on television. And so a lot of people wound up with a pervasive fear that persisted ongoing until such time as they could process them.
And probably school shootings.
Yes,
have a lot
absolutely.
to do with that. Now,
some other anxiety disorders that are common would be obsessive compulsive disorder, more commonly known as OCD. And these are obsessions, which are unwanted intrusive thoughts, and compulsions, which are repetitive behaviors or mental acts. And these are things that are intruded upon the person. They do not want these, but they still keep coming in. And then there are phobias, and this is unreasonable or excessive fear and anxiety response. It causes you to avoid certain activities, last at least 6 months. So whereas an example could be, I'm afraid of heights, so I'm just not going to go up in that building, to I have a phobia of heights, I'm not going to go up on that step ladder. And it really can have an impairment in your day-to-day function. Okay. Special stressors for the current generation. These would include COVID. So recent research has shown a significant increase in reports of stress and anxiety within the children since the COVID outbreak. I think we can all kind of see that within the families that we are working with. This is partially due to factors of social isolation, missed milestones, increased family tension, pervasive heightened sense of stress, where they just feel that danger is always around the corner. Additionally, the current population current children have to deal with school violence. This really wasn't something that we even thought of much until the late 90s, early 2000s, that you could go to school and not come back. But now these children are having, this is their reality, that especially if they see the news is being shared with them. Then there's also international strife and conflict. So this would be war and migration. These can definitely affect the people that are migrating and in the war, but this can also be an effect of our current connectedness. And so if I, as a child, am reading up on the war in Gaza quite a bit, I may empathize to an unhealthy amount with a young child that had to go through all of the trauma associated with that. Likewise with migration, it's going to affect the children that are migrating, but it also affects the communities they migrate into. Let's move on. Okay. What can we as church leaders do? Let's shrink this just a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay. First and foremost, you can create a safe space for children to feel affirmed and supported. You want to share emotions and encourage others to do likewise. This doesn't mean that you have to be an open book about all your emotions, but this means that you need to be open about sharing. If you're having a hard time, just say, hey, I'm having a hard time today, guys. Bear with me for a bit. And making it okay for those others to share likewise. You need to demonstrate appropriate and healthy boundaries. So it's important to set up where that we want to be supportive and there for people. But if we are enmeshed in their problems, we're not going to be helpful. We want to develop healthy social environments and skills. So this is just modeling some of these appropriate skills for children on how to deal with some of the stress and anxiety. We want to share the unconditional love of Jesus and his teachings. I mean, that's a big part of it right there. If a child knows that I can screw up royally and I'm still loved, that goes a long way. And then we want to provide parent education and support as well, so that especially if a parent is feeling stressed, they don't have to necessarily disseminate that to their children.
We have a program. We won't go into it in great depth right now because of time, but the Anderson school system developed a program called Peacemakers. This is a program that they've done for many years. The school social workers work with kindergarten, first and second graders, and third, I guess. Every year they have about 6 sessions where they teach them how to be peacemakers. And peacemakers basically are kind of what we talked about in learning choices. They're saying, to be a peacemaker, you need to understand that your first impulse is not the one you need to respond to. You will have a number of impulses that might direct you to make certain kinds of choices. But if you think those out, you will have a variety of different options to choose between. And so this has been an extremely helpful program for children. When I worked with some of these same children, when they got into high school and were acting out and having delinquent issues, I would say, do you remember when you were a peacemaker in elementary school? And a lot of them would smile and say, yeah, I kind of remember about choices. And they had forgotten. They had slipped into being creatures of habit instead of people who could list 30 options and pick between. And it is amazing that children at very young ages can pause that second and think first. My granddaughter was acting out one Sunday when we were down there, and she was about 3. And her parents had enough of her and sent her to her room. And she came out about 5 minutes later with a book that her mom was reading to her. And she handed the book to her mom, and the book was on choices and counting to 5 before you make a poor choice. And she handed her mom the book and said, well, I counted to 5. And I guess that was supposed to clean the slate and get back to normal. But I felt positive about her understanding that if she just pauses for a moment, she has better choices available. So Peacemakers teaches that we all have conflicts, disagreements, and arguments with each other. But a peacemaker is a person who solves problems without hurting themselves or others. A peacemaker has different brackets with different techniques and has a curriculum, like I said, that goes through kindergarten to 3rd. It's just been a wonderful program that I've observed in the school, and one of those examples of how we can teach kids to respond to issues without violence.
And if people want references for these, we have some handouts that we can send to people. We just didn't include them in this necessarily. So I think we are going to open up the questions and answers at this point. Before I close this so we can see all of your faces, I just wondered if people have additional questions that they don't get to today. You can reach out to my dad at jewenger@hotmail.com. He's more reliable about answering his email than I am, so he volunteered to take that role on. And we will respond to your questions if we don't get to them today. That's just an additional option. But we are going to get to some of these questions that have been coming up, and we will also open up to anyone that wants to talk about some questions.
For any of you here online that want to ask your question, I encourage you to do that so we can talk about it. And if you just actually raise your hand on your screen, I'll be able to move you up to the top row so that John and Adam can more easily talk directly to you and everyone can see you talking, even if you're on a smaller screen. So Adam and John, I'll let you also look back through the questions to see which of the things you might want to pick up. But if any of you here have a question, feel free to raise your hand and I'll make it possible for you to be in dialogue, which is even better than trying to do things through the chat.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the questions was, what are the tools that teachers and pastors can use to counter missed milestones? And that great question. First of all, as we said, we may need to listen to children to find out what milestones they are missing. Does that mean that are they educational? What we do know, those of you who, like myself, have talked to college professors, sure know that during COVID and after, students come into their freshman year in college with some basic educational milestones they've missed, which sure increases a whole lot of stress in trying to act like they've got the same skills as others, and they don't. But the emotional milestones of social skills, for instance, perhaps we need, whether youth groups are involved or children's activities in helping model some correct social skills and giving time and opportunity to have positive interactions with mothers. Others of you may have other ideas of what the church can, what you're doing and what churches can do.
A lot of trying to help someone to make up for a missed milestone is a lot of times what happens is someone felt unsafe or unable to move forward. And so a lot of times just developing a positive relationship with that person, allowing them to feel heard and try to work out some of the issues around that type of thing. So such as, for instance, if someone lost a parent at a very young age, they may be stuck in a mindset of a 6-year-old. It's helping them to process the pain and anxiety that they went through then, and helping them to learn new skills on how to think. Oh, well, I see you respond instantly when you have a conflict. Maybe let's work on some of these skills on how to think before we speak, those types of things. I see Gail has a question.
Yeah, so I often want to hear from teachers who are looking with this new generation of students that went through COVID and what milestones their students are missing, and how are there specific tools that they're trying to utilize. One thing I've heard is that the students have their eyes directed at the floor rather than looking up at what the teacher is talking. So they've never had to look at, in a classroom setting. And, I'm wondering if there are resources that would help with youth groups or anything people have that would work with young children to how to help them see what's safe, since they probably don't have experience of what's safe.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the skills that when we interacted more face-to-face, we had more direct eye contact. And when kids, I don't know how much social media has affected that. And the ability to have, instead of looking at the screen or looking down, develop that comfort with eye-to-eye contact.
There's also, unfortunately, the myth of multitasking that has played a part in this. So, unfortunately, there's been a lot of research saying you can only focus on one thing at a time, regardless of what you believe. So there are a lot of people that believe the myth of, I can do multiple things at the same time. And so they will think that they can look at a screen and be engaged in the conversation, when in reality, that's not the case. And helping them to unlearn some of these myths sometimes is helpful. Does that answer the question at all? Or
well, I certainly don't have expertise, and I know that some people on this chat on the Zoom probably have a lot more expertise they could share.
That's where sharing together allows us all to learn.
Yep, we're all on journey.
One of the things I found is 50 years as a psychologist, it gave me maybe 1% of the answers. The rest of the 99 I don't have.
And the real goal is not giving an answer. It's helping the person find the right answer for them.
Mm-hmm.
So I believe Tom has a question.
Yes, good afternoon. Or at least for me, it's afternoon. I'm in Maryland. So anyway, my ministry at this point has been primarily as a hospital chaplain, and there is a I would have a tendency to think hospital ministry that people believe that a child, especially a young child's grief process, will be negatively impacted by open casket funerals. Do you have any data on that?
I know. In fact, I find for some children an open casket is very helpful because it gives the reality that the person is no longer there. And I have found some children, when it's a closed casket, they still live with the fantasy that that person may just show up.
In addition, there's far more variability within the population than there is between populations. So for some individuals, it will be more advantageous to have that final closure. And for some children, they may not process it the same. Unfortunately, there's no guidebook to tell us exactly who is going to take it where. The best thing we can do is just offer our understanding and our patience and our ears for them so that we can support them in the process.
Yeah, I think the key is there listening to the child after the experience and allowing them to share how they're processing that experience.
Well, I attempt. I mean, I'm not God, but I attempt to turn to the parent and say, well, what does your child say to you about this?
Yes.
And unfortunately, oftentimes I found a situation where actually the parent is not going to engage the child. They're going to make the decision for the child.
Yep.
And I mean, maybe this is just my own bias. I find that to be very sad.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that bias.
Especially if it was a close relative. But obviously, especially in a hospital, you can't tell a parent what to do.
Yeah.
But if I can't influence the parent,
what we can do,
I do encourage them to be in conversation with the child.
Yes.
So,
yes, you're right.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah, we can't tell parents what to do, but we can model for them what might be helpful.
Absolutely. And again, this is where grace will come in. If you have an open casket and for that child that is traumatizing, that's not the end of the world. You can then work with that child and say, okay, let's get through what that caused for you and let's process this. It's all about the relationship and making sure that the child feels safe, feels heard, and is able to express themselves and come up with solutions that will work for them.
With
maybe
go ahead.
Maybe the question would be to ask the parent if they've talked it over with their child instead of what their decision would be.
Yeah.
Or have you considered what is best for your child in this process? Yes, absolutely.
And the other thing, as parents and as caregivers in whatever capacity, children are quite resilient. a lot of times we err on the side of trying to not say something for fear that it might traumatize them.
We're trying to shelter them, yes.
Yeah. And then it proves to not be the right answer. I've said some things where people come back and say, well, I don't want to talk about that. And well, that's fine. It's better to have asked the questions a lot of times than to have just remained silent.
And again, the issue of failing safely with some of these issues is if we make the mistake, if we're engaged in a dialogue with the child, we can talk about, okay, this didn't work. What would be the next step? What are some other options on how to deal with this? What is it that you need us to achieve to feel a sense of success for yourself?
Well, I see that we have about 3 minutes left, so we have time for just a couple more quick questions. I will call your attention to one in the chat. Is it possible to share the printable copy of the responsible parent worksheet, or is that a copyrighted thing?
No. It came from, we can share that. And it came from a book about 50 years old, but that's how old that's when I did my material. It's called Systematic Training for Effective Parenting by Dinkmeyer and McKay. And it just has some really neat charts in there that allow us to look at logical, and a lot of times it talks about logical consequences. It doesn't matter whether we are too lenient or too strict. It matters that we have consistency within the responsibilities and responses with the children we're working with.
Okay. And Sarah, I see that you've got a question.
Not so much a question, but I did want to address, you had made the comment that a lot of young people aren't going into this field. And I wanted to, I guess, share on a positive note. My daughter suffers general anxiety, pretty severe, and she is going into art therapy.
Amen.
With children.
Good.
And so there is, have you seen a lot of art therapists, or what would you recommend in using art to work with children to process their emotions?
You know, I haven't looked into like the masters or advanced programs in art therapy. I've worked with those who have at least specialized in that. And a lot of times they would get a master's like in being an MSW and then get some other training in art therapy. But art is just one of the wonderful expressions, like play therapy, that allows children to express who they are and using that medium to feel more safe in dealing with more trauma.
It also allows them to access a portion of their brain that is more developed already, because as we grow, the frontal lobe is growing more and more, and that's more where we are developing our rational thought and those types of things. Art, this allows the children, maybe they don't have the words to express it, but they have another outlet that does or exists within them to express it. So it's an excellent.
Yeah, excellent option.
Well, we're really at the end of our time. So this has been a great course. John and Adam, thank you so much for taking your time to coordinate this and coordinate with each other and to share this with us. I will be sending out a recording link, and then any of the resources you send me, I'll be glad to distribute to the whole class. And thank you for also sharing your email address. John and Adam have also said they're willing to stay a few minutes afterwards if anyone has final questions. But with all of our gratitude, I also want to give the two of you a chance to say whatever final words or wrap the course in a way that you would think would be fitting.
I hope that no one feels overwhelmed by what we've said. There's not many ways we can mess up. If we unconditionally love the children we work with, and we let them know that we simply want to be a listening ear for them, they're going to do fine.
Absolutely. The takeaway is be there for them unconditionally, and allow them to express themselves in the way they need to. kids are very resilient. If we provide that support, they find their way a lot of times.
Well, that's a great note to end on. Again, thank you so much. And with this, our course is over. Please come back for more of our Ventures courses, but we'll be in touch with that recording link and others. So feel free to go. But if you have a few final things to talk to John and Adam about, they'll be here for a couple more minutes. Thank you so much for being part of this great course.